They called it wet nursing. But for thousands of enslaved black women, it was something else entirely. They were forced to breastfeed the children of their enslavers while their own babies cried in hunger. And when they showed pain, they were whipped. Under slavery, even a mother's milk was stolen. These women weren't allowed to feed their own first. They weren't allowed to grieve. They weren't even allowed to say no. You've heard stories about plantations and punishment. But this one happened in nurseries and cradles. It happened in silence, in secret, and in suffering. This is what wet nursing really meant for black women under slavery. And this time, we're breaking that silence. In the system of American chattel slavery, black women were not only considered property, they were also reduced to reproductive tools. From the moment of their capture or birth into slavery, their physical bodies were marked for exploitation. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the forced transformation of black mothers into wet nurses for white children. These women were made to nurse the offspring of their enslavers while their own children went hungry, fell ill, or died from neglect. This was not an occasional practice, it was widespread and systematic. Wet nursing, historically, referred to the act of one woman breastfeeding another's child. Among European aristocracies, it was a well-established tradition that wealthy women would employ poorer women to nurse their infants. In the American South, this tradition mutated into something far more brutal under the regime of slavery. Enslaved women were selected for their reproductive capacity, with enslavers timing their pregnancies to coincide with those of their white mistresses. This ensured that a black woman would have breast milk available to feed the white infant from birth. Slave owners took meticulous care in regulating the bodies of enslaved women to suit their own needs. Women of childbearing age were often evaluated not only for their strength in the field, but also for their fertility. Some enslavers kept records of births, nursing cycles, and milk output. It was common for enslaved women who had just given birth to be abruptly removed from their children and sent to the big house to wet nurse the enslaver's newborn. These decisions were made without consent and with no regard for the well-being of the mother or her infant. The consequences for the enslaved children were often fatal. Deprived of their mother's milk, black infants were fed makeshift substitutes like cow's milk, water-soaked bread, or a mixture of molasses and cornmeal. These lacked the nutrients and antibodies critical to early development. Infant mortality rates among enslaved populations were staggeringly high. In some regions, up to 50% of enslaved children died before the age of 5. While many factors contributed to this, disease, malnutrition, overwork, the removal of nursing mothers from their infants undoubtedly played a major role. Enslaved women were acutely aware of the dangers. Accounts from formerly enslaved individuals, recorded in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, repeatedly emphasized the pain and grief mothers felt when denied the chance to feed or care for their children. One woman recalled being forced to nurse the enslaver's child directly after giving birth, while her own baby remained alone and hungry. When she cried from the pain and anguish, she was beaten for insubordination. Wet nursing also had broader implications for how white society viewed black womanhood. It reinforced the dehumanizing idea that black bodies existed to serve white needs in every intimate way. A black woman's milk, intended by nature for her own child, was repurposed as a resource for white lineage. Her nurturing instinct, weaponized and commodified, became another form of labor extracted by force. White families who refused to allow their own wives to breastfeed saw no contradiction in demanding it from the black women they enslaved. This exploitative dynamic fed directly into racist stereotypes that would persist long after slavery ended. The myth of the mammy, the jolly maternal black woman who devoted her life to caring for white children, was rooted in the reality of the wet nurse. But the historical truth was far from affectionate. Enslaved women were not volunteers. They were coerced, threatened, and beaten into obedience. Their emotional trauma, physical exhaustion, and maternal grief were ignored in favor of white comfort and convenience. Punishment for resisting this role was swift and brutal. Refusing to nurse a white infant was considered defiance. Women who hesitated, cried, or attempted to spend extra time with their own babies were routinely whipped, starved, or locked away. Some were even permanently reassigned from household labor to the fields as punishment, exposed to harsher conditions and heavier workloads. Others had their own children taken away altogether, either sold off or relocated to distant parts of the plantation to sever the maternal bond. There are numerous documented accounts of this violence. In some cases, white mistresses expressed jealousy or disdain at how easily the enslaved woman bonded with her child, or even with the white child. These emotional dynamics added an unpredictable layer of risk. A mistress might accuse a wet nurse of slowness, laziness, or undue attachment to the infant, resulting in severe physical punishment. The act of breastfeeding, which should have been intimate and life-giving, became a battlefield of power, dominance, and fear. Medical journals and plantation records from the 19th century provide further evidence of this practice. Some slave owners recorded the number of nursing women available on their estates, referring to them not by name, but as assets contributing to the welfare of the household. Doctors were sometimes consulted, not to ensure the health of the black infant, but to confirm that the enslaved woman was producing enough milk for the white child. The health of the enslaved baby was, at best, a secondary concern. What makes this practice particularly devastating is how invisible it became in mainstream historical memory. Wet nursing was sanitized in post-bellum literature and popular culture, turned into nostalgic tales of faithful servants who loved the family like their own. The truth that these women were exploited, terrorized, and stripped of the ability to care for their own offspring was deliberately obscured. It is only in recent decades that scholars have begun to recenter these narratives and acknowledge the psychological, physical, and generational impact of this form of abuse. Black women's labor has always been at the foundation of American wealth, but in the case of enslaved wet nurses, the labor was not just physical. It was biological, emotional, and maternal. These women were forced to give not only their strength, but their milk, their time, and their love to a system that denied them humanity. Their own children were treated as collateral damage. Their grief was not recorded in plantation ledgers. It lived only in the memories passed down through generations, in stories whispered at night, in the silent mourning of mothers who were never allowed to mother. The institution of slavery was maintained through a complex system of control that extended beyond physical labor and into the most intimate aspects of life. For enslaved women, especially those used as wet nurses, control over their reproductive and maternal functions was absolute. The process by which enslavers orchestrated pregnancies and lactation cycles was not random. It was intentional, calculated, and centered on economic benefit. Planters sought to time the pregnancies of enslaved women so their lactation would coincide with the births of white children in the household. This often meant that women were paired off with other enslaved men selected for strength or health, with the clear goal of producing more valuable offspring. Enslaved women were sometimes impregnated by force, either through coerced pairings or outright rape. Once pregnant, their nutrition and labor demands were sometimes adjusted, again, not out of concern for their health or the babies, but to ensure they would produce enough milk. Once the white mistress gave birth, and if she could not or would not breastfeed, the enslaved wet nurse was summoned. Medical professionals of the time noted this practice in writing. An 1852 medical manual, for example, advised slave-owning families on how to choose and prepare a nurse, noting that enslaved women were the most readily available source. The preferred nurse was young, healthy, and had recently given birth. She was expected to feed the white infant on command and maintain a supply of milk through regular nursing, regardless of her own baby's needs. Enslaved women did not have a say in how this was conducted. They were moved into the homes of their enslavers, often separated from their own children for long periods. The frequency of breastfeeding, sleep schedule, and even diet were now dictated by the needs of the enslaver's child. Some enslaved women were required to sleep in or near the nursery to respond immediately to any cries. Others were housed just outside the white family's quarters for rapid access. These arrangements were monitored closely by mistresses, midwives, or overseers. Historical records reveal that many enslavers kept detailed notes about lactation productivity, logging how often the nurse was breastfeeding and whether the white infant was gaining weight. If the baby did not thrive, blame was often placed on the enslaved woman. She might be accused of withholding milk, being careless, or showing favoritism toward her own child. Punishments for such accusations included beatings, confinement, or reassignment to field work. Some women were permanently removed from household duties if they were deemed too attached to their own children or showed signs of distress. Despite the dangers, many enslaved women tried to maintain bonds with their babies. They visited when allowed, nursed quickly in hidden moments, or asked older women in the quarters to care for the children in their absence. But the limited access meant that their own babies were fed irregularly and inadequately. Wet nurses sometimes leaked milk uncontrollably, unable to regulate their supply, and some developed painful infections like mastitis from overuse or stress. There was no medical support. Pain was simply expected. These conditions created a psychological torment that enslaved women were forced to endure in silence. Many former slaves interviewed in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration described the emotional cost of being separated from their mothers for white children's sake. Some remembered crying endlessly as infants. Others recounted how their mothers were often away in the big house and could only come late at night. For those women, the guilt of seeing their own babies grow weaker while nourishing the children of their enslavers was unbearable. But showing emotion was dangerous. Crying could be interpreted as defiance. The practice of punishing enslaved women for expressing grief was part of a larger pattern of emotional suppression. Slave owners understood that they could not allow humanity to flourish among the people they enslaved. Mothers who wept, begged, or resisted were seen as threats. One historical case from Louisiana describes an enslaved woman who was whipped after she attempted to nurse her own baby before feeding the white child. In another documented instance, a woman was tied to a tree and flogged for crying too loudly after her infant died. These were not isolated events. They reflected the brutal logic of slavery. The dynamics between white mistresses and wet nurses were complex and often tense. Many white women viewed enslaved nurses with suspicion, jealousy, or resentment. They relied on these women to keep their children alive while resenting the intimacy that developed between the child and the nurse. In some cases, white children formed strong attachments to their black nurses. This attachment was usually tolerated when the child was young but discouraged or mocked as they grew older. White children were taught to grow out of their dependence, while the black woman was reminded of her place. The plantation economy benefited enormously from this enforced caregiving. A healthy white heir meant continuation of the family's wealth and land. The cost of keeping a wet nurse was minimal because the woman was already enslaved. Her reproductive cycle and milk production were simply added to the economic output expected from her labor. Some slave owners even calculated the additional value of a female slave who had a reputation as a good nurse. They could rent her out to neighbors or factor her wet nursing ability into her resale price. Slave sale advertisements and auctions sometimes listed lactation as a feature. A woman being sold might be described as a fine nurse or currently in milk, signaling her usefulness to potential buyers. In such transactions, women were sold with or without their infants, depending on the buyer's needs. If the buyer wanted only the wet nurse, her child might be left behind or sold separately. These separations were among the most traumatic experiences for enslaved women. While the economic system was obsessed with productivity, very little was done to address the long-term health outcomes for the women or the babies involved. Wet nurses who became ill or could no longer produce milk were discarded from nursery duties and reassigned. There was no concern for their recovery, mental health, or family connections. Their children, if still living, had already suffered critical setbacks in nutrition and bonding. By the time slavery ended in 1865, the scars of the system were already embedded in generations. Enslaved women had been forced into unnatural and damaging maternal roles that denied them the basic rights of motherhood. Their milk was taken, their time was taken, and their children were taken. The legacy of this system would continue to influence how Black motherhood was perceived and controlled long after emancipation. Separation of enslaved mothers from their children was a central trauma within the institution of slavery. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the practice of wet nursing, where Black women were assigned to feed, comfort, and nurture white children, while their own infants were left behind or outright neglected. These women experienced a profound psychological rupture, the enforced denial of maternal care under threat of violence. Infant mortality rates were high across the antebellum South, but enslaved infants consistently faced worse outcomes than white children. According to historical census data and plantation records, death rates for enslaved infants were staggering, often exceeding 30% in the first year of life. Malnutrition, disease, lack of consistent breastfeeding, and poor sanitation all played roles. For wet nurses whose milk was redirected toward white babies, these risks were even higher. White plantation owners did not see these deaths as tragedies. Enslaved infants were considered part of the estate's human capital, and while valuable in theory, they were replaceable. A mother's grief carried no weight. In fact, grieving openly for a lost child could invite suspicion or punishment. Enslavers expected emotional neutrality from Black women who served in the house. Crying was viewed as a sign of disobedience or instability. This emotional suppression was documented repeatedly in first-hand testimonies from formerly enslaved women. One woman interviewed in the 1930s recalled how her own mother had been forced to return to work immediately after losing a baby. "They say she cries too much," the woman recounted, "so they whip her and send her to the big house to work anyhow. No rest for sorrow." Such testimonies reveal that the grief of enslaved mothers was criminalized. The limited time enslaved mothers had with their own children also affected bonding and development. Scholars have noted that many enslaved children were raised primarily by elderly women or older siblings in the quarters, rather than by their mothers. This was not by choice, but by design. Mothers sent to the big house as nurses could not breastfeed regularly, and many were allowed only brief visits, sometimes just minutes a day. During those visits, they had to prioritize feeding over nurturing, leaving little space for emotional closeness. Enslavers believed they were acting in the best interests of their own children by employing enslaved wet nurses. Yet this arrangement was built on the belief that Black women's bodies existed to serve white families first. A child born to an enslaved woman was not seen as her child, but as an asset, one that could be sold, traded, or assigned labor at any age. Conversely, the white child she was forced to nurture was treated with care, indulgence, and affection. The juxtaposition was not only cruel but dehumanizing. There are surviving records of white slaveholding women expressing jealousy or hostility toward their children's wet nurses. In some cases, these mistresses feared their own children might develop emotional bonds with their Black nurses that rivaled or even surpassed the mother-child relationship. Southern women's journals and personal letters sometimes include comments that reveal both dependence on and disdain for the enslaved women in their homes. They relied on them, but they also resented the intimacy the role required. In other instances, mistresses punished nurses for showing affection to white children, accusing them of spoiling or over-coddling. These contradictory expectations, nurture the child but remain invisible, kept wet nurses in a perpetual state of fear. They had to perform constant emotional labor, suppressing their own feelings while reading the moods of both children and mistresses. Mistakes could result in punishment or reassignment, often without explanation. Violence was a constant backdrop to this emotional suppression. Punishment for failing to satisfy the needs of the white family could be swift and brutal. A wet nurse who did not produce enough milk, refused to breastfeed on command, or asked to visit her own child might be whipped. Others were punished for emotional outbursts, including crying or collapsing from exhaustion. Some were beaten for failing to quiet a white baby quickly enough. The logic of the system was simple. The white child's comfort justified any measure of discipline against the black woman. Beyond the violence, many enslaved women described the humiliation of being treated like livestock. Their bodies were evaluated for productivity. Their breasts were touched, examined, and monitored without consent. Doctors or mistresses sometimes imposed diets or schedules on them based on pseudoscientific beliefs about milk supply. Some women were instructed not to eat certain foods, not to rest at specific hours, or to avoid particular behaviors that might spoil the milk. These guidelines were rarely based on real medical knowledge and often conflicted with the wet nurse's actual needs. The trauma of repeated separations extended across generations. Mothers who had been denied the chance to nurse their babies often later watched as their daughters were forced into the same role. Enslaved families passed down stories not just of physical suffering, but of emotional and spiritual loss, of children who grew up unfamiliar with their mothers, of infants who died unnamed, and of grief that could not be spoken aloud. These stories formed a quiet resistance, a memory preserved in song, whispered warning, or ritual gesture. Historians have noted that this multi-generational trauma was a form of social engineering. By breaking the maternal bond early, enslavers hoped to reduce emotional ties among enslaved people and increase dependence on the plantation system. If a woman could not protect or raise her own child, she might be less likely to resist or escape. This tactic, targeting the emotional center of family life, was particularly effective in reinforcing power. Even after slavery ended, the aftershocks of these practices lingered. In the decades following emancipation, black motherhood continued to be scrutinized, criticized, and controlled. Stereotypes about neglectful or unfit black mothers were rooted in the very system that had denied them the right to parent in the first place. The image of the mammy, always nurturing white children, never her own, became a cultural myth that obscured the violence and coercion behind wet nursing. Meanwhile, the stories of real enslaved women who suffered under this system were largely erased from public memory. For over a century, the role of wet nurses was romanticized in Southern literature and media. Only in recent decades have historians begun to recover the full scope of their exploitation and the depth of their suffering. Within the system of American slavery, punishment was used not only to enforce labor, but to crush spirit. For enslaved women forced to wet nurse white children, even the most human responses, such as grief, fatigue, or tears, were treated as defiance. Plantation records, slave narratives, and eyewitness accounts document repeated instances where enslaved women were violently punished for expressing emotions that interfered with their imposed roles. Crying, particularly in the presence of a white child, was not tolerated. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, conducted interviews with thousands of formerly enslaved individuals. Among them were women who had served as wet nurses or worked closely with enslaved caregivers. Their testimonies showed that enslaved women were expected to maintain composure under all conditions. If a white child under their care became distressed, or if the woman herself showed signs of distress, especially during feedings, it was interpreted as laziness, insolence, or instability. One former enslaved woman recalled a younger girl on her plantation who had just lost her infant. The girl was reassigned the next day to the nursery to feed a white child. When she wept quietly while nursing the baby, she was reported to the mistress. "She acted ungrateful," the mistress said, and ordered her whipped. Another account describes an enslaved woman beaten with a riding crop for pulling away slightly when the master's child bit her during feeding. Resistance, even accidental, was never tolerated. Physical punishment was not always immediate. In many households, emotional surveillance was constant. A wet nurse might be punished days later for what was described as a bad attitude. Households maintained strict hierarchies, and any perceived deviation from the expected behavior, docility, gentleness, and constant availability, was considered a punishable offense. The justification for punishment was often thin. A white mistress might claim that a wet nurse's tears made her child anxious. Others insisted that crying reduced the quality or flow of milk. Slaveholding manuals and advice books circulated in the antebellum South offered guidance to white women on managing enslaved nurses. These texts advised mistresses to keep the nurse contented, but warned that too much leniency could lead to slackness. Discipline was framed as a necessary part of keeping the enslaved woman fit to serve. Enslaved women were thus placed in an impossible situation. They were commanded to mother children who were not theirs, denied access to their own babies, and punished for the emotional strain that this unnatural condition caused. There was no space to grieve, no avenue for appeal. Pain was seen as a sign of weakness. Silence and obedience were the only protections. In some households, wet nurses were physically restrained during feedings. Eyewitnesses have described scenes where enslaved women were forced to sit on low stools for hours, children brought to them on demand. Crying children might be thrust at them without warning, and if the wet nurse flinched or hesitated, she risked being reported for refusing service. Some were made to nurse while standing in corners or holding their arms above their heads if they had previously misbehaved. These forms of humiliation were designed to break will, to remind the woman of her lack of control. Whippings were the most common punishment. Records from southern plantations describe punishments ranging from 10 to 50 lashes for disobedience. In some cases, wet nurses were whipped across the shoulders or back while still leaking milk, the blood and milk mixing and soaking through their clothing. The presence of pain or injury did not excuse them from their duties. Even with open wounds or fever, they were expected to continue nursing. Some punishments were public. Plantation owners used public whipping as a warning to others. Children, both black and white, might witness the punishment, further reinforcing the social order. In these moments, the wet nurse was transformed in the eyes of everyone, from nurturer to criminal, from surrogate mother to problem. This shift served the plantation system. It erased sympathy and replaced it with fear. The psychological trauma of this treatment compounded over time. Wet nurses often spoke of the physical toll, swollen breasts, cracked nipples, infections, but rarely were they allowed to speak about the emotional pain. That silence was enforced by threat. Speaking out could lead to beatings, isolation, or sale. Some women attempted to rebel silently, refusing to eat, intentionally underproducing milk, or feigning illness. These forms of resistance were dangerous, but for some, it was the only available way to assert autonomy. The risk of retribution extended to other enslaved people who offered comfort. In one account, a fellow house slave was whipped simply for consoling a nurse who had been crying. The mistress considered it encouraging weakness. Bonds of sisterhood among enslaved women were often tested by these conditions. Solidarity could be a lifeline, but it could also bring punishment. Occasionally, enslaved nurses did attempt to flee. One documented case in Georgia involves a woman who ran away shortly after being forced to nurse her enslaver's child while her own baby lay sick in the quarters. She was caught days later, brutally whipped, and permanently reassigned to field labor. The message was clear. Your feelings, your child, your body, they all belong to us. Religious instruction was also weaponized against wet nurses. Some mistresses told the women that God had chosen them to serve in this role, that they should be grateful for the honor of caring for white children. Passages from the Bible were twisted to justify their servitude and silence. These manipulations added another layer to the violence, one that reached beyond the body and into the soul. Yet despite this orchestrated dehumanization, many enslaved women found ways to protect their children emotionally. They composed lullabies, passed on prayers, or left instructions with elders on how to soothe a child in their absence. These acts, though small, were forms of resistance. They kept alive a sense of identity that the system tried to erase. The stories of enslaved black women who were forced into wet nursing have been buried for generations. While records of economic transactions, property logs, and plantation diaries often mention the presence of a nurse girl or mammy, the personal experiences of these women, especially the psychological and physical costs of being made to nourish the children of their oppressors, were rarely documented in their own words. Their suffering was both visible and invisible. part of the machinery of slavery, but treated as unworthy of attention in the historical record. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved women carried the long-term consequences of forced wet nursing into their lives. Oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s revealed that some of these women continued to experience pain from untreated infections and breast trauma sustained during enslavement. Others shared stories of children who had died or suffered malnutrition due to their mothers being denied the ability to nurse them. Some had never been able to bond with their own children in the ways they had hoped, because they were emotionally or physically absent during those critical early years. Even after slavery, the racialized legacy of wet nursing continued. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during the era of Jim Crow segregation, Black women were still often employed by white families as domestic help and nannies. Many were expected to take on child-rearing duties, including bottle feeding or comforting white infants, while still caring for their own children in separate impoverished communities. The dynamic of prioritizing white families' needs over their own never truly disappeared. It simply changed form. Wages were low, hours were long, and social mobility was almost non-existent. The stereotype of the mammy was crafted during this period and retroactively applied to enslaved wet nurses. Through films, literature, and advertisements, American society romanticized the image of the loyal, heavy-set Black woman who joyfully raised white children while neglecting her own. This image erased the trauma, coercion, and pain behind the historical reality. It sanitized the violence of slavery and painted exploitation as devotion. The mammy trope became a cultural tool to justify ongoing inequality and to suppress uncomfortable truths about the past. Meanwhile, the generational trauma inflicted by this system lived on in the families of the women who had endured it. Children raised without maternal care, or with limited access to physical nourishment, often suffered developmental setbacks. In enslaved communities, death rates for infants were disproportionately high. While exact statistics are difficult to confirm, data from antebellum plantations consistently show high mortality rates among Black children under the age of 5. Malnutrition, disease, and lack of maternal contact all contributed. Scholars today link some of this loss directly to forced wet nursing. In academic circles, the study of wet nursing under slavery remained a niche topic until relatively recently. For much of the 20th century, historians focused more on the economic or political aspects of slavery rather than the intimate bodily experiences of enslaved women. But with the rise of Black feminist scholarship in the 1970s and 1980s, researchers began to unearth and center these stories. Authors such as Deborah Gray White, Darlene Clark Hine, and Jennifer Morgan helped bring visibility to the intersection of race, gender, and reproductive exploitation. Their work highlighted how the body of the Black woman was commodified under slavery in ways that were both labor-based and reproductive. Enslaved women were not only expected to work the fields or tend the homes, they were also expected to reproduce the next generation of enslaved laborers and provide nurturing care to their enslavers' children. This dual function of productive and reproductive labor was unique in its cruelty and remains central to understanding how racial capitalism operated in the American South. In recent decades, museums and cultural institutions have begun to confront this history more directly. Exhibits at the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, for example, depict the lives of enslaved women and mothers with painful honesty. Memorials, scholarly publications, and public history projects now give voice to those who were once silenced. But there is still much work to be done. Many school curricula still fail to address the full reality of slavery's impact on Black motherhood. Some descendants of enslaved women have also sought to reclaim and honor this hidden legacy. In genealogical research and family oral traditions, the stories of women who nursed, served, and survived are being pieced back together. These efforts push back against the erasure that followed emancipation and aim to restore the humanity and agency of those who were treated as property. The trauma of forced wet nursing reverberates today. It is present in ongoing disparities in maternal health, in the social expectations placed on black women to provide emotional labor without recognition, and in the economic structures that still underpay and undervalue care work. Studies consistently show that black women in the U.S. face higher maternal mortality rates, more frequent denial of pain relief during childbirth, and worse infant health outcomes. These realities are not disconnected from the past. They are shaped by it. By remembering what was done to enslaved wet nurses, not just the fact that they were forced to serve, but the ways in which they were punished, silenced, and erased, we make a step toward historical honesty. It is not enough to acknowledge slavery as an abstract evil. Its specific cruelties must be named, especially those targeting black women's bodies and motherhood. Only then can we begin to dismantle the cultural myths that still surround this history. The myths that turn pain into loyalty, that turn resistance into silence, and that turn human suffering into background noise for a more palatable narrative. The truth is, black women did not choose to give their milk. They were coerced, brutalized, and punished for even grieving the theft of their children's nourishment. That truth deserves to be remembered in full clarity. And if you believe these women deserve to be remembered for what they endured, and not erased, then help share their story. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss the truths they tried to bury. We're here to unlock Black history with nothing held back. Until next time, take care.